Imagine standing in a room made of gold and silk, surrounded by hundreds of people bowing at your feet, yet feeling a bone-chilling isolation that no crown could ever cure. Imagine the most powerful woman in the world, a queen who defied empires, dying not in her bed, but on her feet, refusing to surrender to the very end. What if I told you that the legendary Virgin Queen was hiding a secret so dark and a pain so deep that it changed the course of history forever? Tonight, we are peeling back the lead-white mask of Elizabeth Tudor to reveal a story of trauma, toxic beauty, and the bizarre food rules that turned a royal banquet into a battlefield of survival. If you're ready to journey into the shadows of the past and uncover the secrets that were never meant to be told, please hit the like button right now and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep bringing these hidden histories to light. Stay with us until the very end, because the truth about Elizabeth is far more haunting than any legend you've ever heard. The air in the royal banquet hall was thick with the scent of roasted peacock, spiced wine, and the underlying metallic tang of hundreds of flickering candles. To any outsider, it was the pinnacle of human achievement, a display of wealth that could buy entire cities. But for those living within the golden cage of the Tudor court, every meal was a high-stakes performance where a single slip of a spoon could mean social or even literal death. The rules of the royal table were not about enjoyment, they were about distance. A monarch was not a mere human who needed to eat, they were a divine being, and their relationship with food had to reflect that. In the courts of Europe, and especially under the watchful eye of the Tudors, the act of eating was transformed into a complex ritual of power. You would see a king or queen sitting at a table groaning with food, yet they would rarely reach for a dish themselves. Highly trained servants, often from noble families, would perform the labor of dining for them. Meat was carved with surgical precision and placed delicately on the royal plate, ensuring the sovereign never had to exert the effort that a commoner would. It was a psychological game. By minimizing the physical act of eating, the monarch maintained an aura of effortless superiority. But behind this effortless facade was a terrifying reality. Poison was the invisible assassin of the Renaissance. Every cup of wine and every slice of venison was a potential weapon. This led to the grim tradition of the royal taster, a person whose entire life was a gamble. Before Elizabeth could take a single sip, another human being had to risk their life to ensure it wasn't laced with arsenic or hemlock. Imagine the tension in the room as the court watched a servant swallow a piece of bread, everyone waiting in a heartbeat of silence to see if they would collapse. This atmosphere of constant low-level terror shaped Elizabeth's soul from the moment she could walk. She didn't see a meal as a comfort, she saw it as a calculated risk. This paranoia was not unfounded. As a woman ruling alone in a man's world, she was a target for every Catholic power in Europe. Her life was a constant exercise in vigilance, and that vigilance extended to the very plate in front of her. The food itself was a bizarre parade of the grotesque and the magnificent. Imagine a swan served with its feathers reattached, or a wild boar's head glazed in gold leaf. These were subtleties, food that was meant to be looked at more than eaten. They were political statements, symbols of the queen's ability to command nature itself. Sugar was the ultimate luxury, and Elizabeth had a legendary sweet tooth. But in the 16th century, sugar was an expensive medicine and a status symbol. It was molded into intricate castles and mythological creatures. However, this love for sugar came with a devastating price. Without modern dentistry, the queen's teeth began to blacken and rot. Foreign ambassadors whispered in their secret reports that the Queen of England's breath was foul and her speech sometimes difficult to understand because of the pain in her jaw. This was a hidden illness that she masked with her regal posture. She would use the blackness of her teeth as a trend, leading her courtiers to blacken their own teeth with soot to show their loyalty and mimic the royal look.
It was a tragic irony, a woman who was the center of beauty and fashion, suffering from the literal decay of her own body caused by the very luxury she used to project power.
As Elizabeth aged, the gap between the public icon and the private woman grew into a vast, dark canyon. To the world, she was Gloriana, the eternal maiden, the sun around which England revolved. To maintain this illusion, she turned to the mask of youth, a thick, toxic concoction of white lead and vinegar known as Venetian ceruse. She would layer this paste onto her face and neck to hide the scars of smallpox and the inevitable wrinkles of time. But the lead was a slow poison. It seeped into her skin, causing it to gray and wither, which required even thicker layers of makeup to hide. It likely contributed to her irritability, memory loss, and depression that haunted her later years. She was literally killing herself to look like a goddess. In her private chambers, away from the prying eyes of ambassadors, she was a frail woman who could barely stand the weight of her own jewels. Her ladies-in-waiting were the only ones who saw the raw, peeling skin and the thinning hair. They were the keepers of the most dangerous secret in England, that the Queen was mortal. Her refusal to marry was the greatest mystery of her age. While she teased the world with potential suitors, Robert Dudley, the Duke of Anjou, King Philip of Spain, she never intended to say "I do." To marry was to surrender. In the 16th century, a husband didn't just share a throne, he owned it. Elizabeth had seen what marriage did to her father's wives. She had seen her own mother's head fall under the axe because she failed to provide a son. Marriage to Elizabeth was associated with death and the loss of self. She chose the hidden illness of loneliness because it was the only way to keep her crown. She turned her virginity into a weapon of state, a shield that kept foreign powers at bay for decades. But the cost was a life where no one could truly touch her, and no one could ever know the woman behind the white paint. She was the architect of her own isolation, a queen who owned a kingdom but didn't have a single person she could fully trust with her heart. To truly understand how Elizabeth survived 4 decades of constant threats, we have to look into the shadows of her court, where the first modern intelligence agency was born. Elizabeth was a queen who trusted no one, and for good reason. Her master of spies, Sir Francis Walsingham, created a massive web of informants that stretched from the back alleys of London to the royal courts of Europe. This atmosphere of constant surveillance meant that Elizabeth lived in a world of whispers. She knew that every letter she wrote could be intercepted, and every word she spoke could be twisted. This constant state of high alert is likely what contributed to her chronic insomnia and her mental exhaustion. She lived her life like a chess player, always thinking 10 moves ahead, never allowing herself the luxury of a spontaneous emotion. Imagine the mental strain of never being able to turn off that protective shield. It is no wonder she suffered from severe anxiety and paranoia. She was a woman who had to be a genius just to stay alive, and that kind of pressure changes a person's soul. When the world became too loud and the politics too treacherous, Elizabeth retreated into the world of the mind. She was perhaps the most educated woman of her era. She spoke 6 languages fluently and could translate complex philosophical texts from Latin and Greek into English just for relaxation. This was her secret weapon. When foreign ambassadors tried to bully her or use flowery language to hide their intentions, she would answer them back in their own tongue with a sharp intellectual wit that left them speechless. She used her intelligence to level the playing field. In a time when women were seen as intellectually inferior, Elizabeth was often the smartest person in any room. This intellectual superiority was another form of threat in the eyes of the men around her. A woman who thought like a man was seen as a danger to the natural order.
But for Elizabeth, her books were her only true friends. They did not ask for favors, they did not plot to take her throne, and they did not judge her for her choices.
However, as she entered her final decade, even her books could not distract her from the physical decline. Her use of the lead-based makeup began to cause more than just skin issues. It likely led to lead poisoning, which causes irritability, memory loss, and depression. The very thing she used to maintain her image was destroying her vitality. During her final golden speech to Parliament in 1601, she admitted that her body was failing, but her heart remained dedicated to her people. She told them that though God had raised her high, she counted the glory of her crown to be that she had reigned with their loves. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, a public admission that the mask was finally slipping. She was preparing her people for the end of an era. The final days at Richmond Palace were not just a medical crisis, but a spiritual one. Elizabeth's refusal to lie down was rooted in a deep superstitious fear. She had seen so many people in her life go to their beds and never wake up. To her, the bed was a place of surrender, and Elizabeth Tudor never surrendered. She stood until her legs swelled, until her breath became labored, and until she could no longer speak. When she finally allowed her ladies to help her onto the cushions, she was a shadow of the woman who had defied the Spanish Armada. The hidden illness that had shaped her destiny, whether it was a physical malady, psychological trauma, or the toxic effects of her own vanity, had finally won. When she died, the crown was passed to James VI of Scotland, the son of the very woman Elizabeth had executed. It was a final, bitter irony of history. The Virgin Queen had protected England, but she could not protect her own bloodline. She died the last of the Tudors, taking her secrets, her paint, and her lonely heart into the silence of Westminster Abbey. To truly grasp the magnitude of Elizabeth's isolation, we must look at the court she created, a glittering, dangerous theater where every word was a performance and every gesture a gamble. The Elizabethan court was not just a seat of government, it was a cult of personality centered entirely on the Queen's body. Elizabeth demanded that her courtiers treat her as a romantic ideal, a fairy queen who was the source of all beauty and light. This created a bizarre atmosphere where elderly advisors had to write love poems to a woman in her 60s just to keep their jobs. While it seems vain on the surface, this was a brilliant political maneuver. By forcing the men of England to compete for her love, she prevented them from competing for her power. She turned her potential rivals into her suitors, keeping them in a state of perpetual adolescence where they were too busy fighting each other for her favor to ever unite against her. But imagine the emotional vacuum this created for Elizabeth herself. To be everyone's son meant she could never be anyone's equal. She was surrounded by thousands of people, yet she lived in an isolation so profound it is hard to fathom. She was the most famous woman in the world, yet no one had touched her as a human being in decades. Beyond the palace walls, the common people of England lived in a different reality. To them, Elizabeth was more than a person, she was a miracle. They had lived through the chaos of her father's many wives, the religious executions under Mary I, and the constant threat of civil war. Under Elizabeth, for the first time in generations, there was a sense of England as a unified identity. The people did not see the lead paint or the decaying teeth. They saw the woman who had brought peace. They celebrated her accession day with more fervor than Christmas. This public adoration was Elizabeth's only true source of comfort. She would often stop her royal processions to speak to a poor person in the crowd or to accept a small gift of flowers from a commoner. These were the only moments where the mask of Gloriana felt real. She understood that while the nobles served her out of ambition, the people loved her out of hope. This bond with the common folk was her true marriage, and she guarded it fiercely.
Yet even this bond was tested by the ailments that modern medicine now seeks to diagnose. Some historians point to her symptoms, the chronic fatigue, the sudden fainting, and the skin lesions, as evidence of something much more common yet equally tragic for a queen, a thyroid disorder, or even a chronic autoimmune condition. In the 16th century, these would have been seen as signs of being unfit or cursed. Elizabeth would have had to hide the tremors in her hands by gripping her scepter tighter. She would have had to hide her exhaustion by standing for hours, proving her strength through sheer agony. This adds a layer of heroism to her story that is often overlooked. She was not just a queen who did not want to marry. She was a woman fighting a daily war against a body that was failing her, all while maintaining the illusion of divine perfection. As we look back, we see Elizabeth not just as a historical figure, but as a warning. She is the ultimate example of what happens when a person is consumed by their public image. She spent so much time building a legend that there was no room left for a life. When she died, they found a small ring on her finger, the locket ring. When they opened it, they found two tiny portraits, one of herself and one of her mother, Anne Boleyn. Even at the very end, after all the wars, the lovers, and the crowns, she was still that 3-year-old girl looking for the mother she had lost. She had carried that secret grief, hidden under gold and jewels, for 66 years. Elizabeth I was the architect of her own loneliness, a woman who chose to be a symbol rather than a human. She saved her country, but she lost herself. To truly understand the environment that molded Elizabeth's psyche, we have to look at the strange and often contradictory world of Elizabethan London, a place where the highest levels of intellectualism met the most brutal forms of entertainment. While the Queen was translating Greek philosophy in her private study, her subjects were flocking to the Southwark pits for bear baiting, or to the Globe Theatre to see the latest blood-soaked tragedy. This was a society comfortable with cruelty, which makes Elizabeth's own internal struggles even more poignant. She lived in a world where physical pain was a constant, and yet her hidden illness was something she treated with a level of psychological sophistication that was centuries ahead of her time. She understood that power was a performance, but she also knew that the theater of the street was just as important as the theater of the court. The true keepers of Elizabeth's secrets were not her ministers or her generals, but her ladies of the bedchamber. These women saw Elizabeth without the wig, without the lead paint, and without the stiff silk gowns. Fragments of their diaries and letters suggest a woman far more fragile than the Iron Queen history remembers. They write of nights spent pacing the corridors, of the Queen talking to herself in different languages, and of her sudden, inexplicable weeping. One account mentions that she would often keep a sword by her side, even while she slept, stabbing at the tapestries in her room if she heard a rustle, convinced that assassins were hiding behind the woven stories of ancient heroes. This wasn't just paranoia, it was the result of a lifetime spent being the target of every Catholic power in Europe. Her ladies were the ones who had to apply the toxic makeup to her sores, and they were the ones who saw the physical price of her virginity. They were sworn to a silence that most of them kept until their own deaths, creating a wall of feminine loyalty that protected the Queen's image better than any army could. Even the laws of the land reflected Elizabeth's obsession with control and image. Did you know that in Elizabethan England it was actually a crime to be unemployed? The vagrancy laws were so strict that if you were found wandering without a master, you could be branded with a V or even hanged. Elizabeth viewed idleness as the mother of conspiracy. She applied this same rigor to her own life. She was never idle. If she wasn't governing, she was hunting. If she wasn't hunting, she was dancing. If she wasn't dancing, she was praying. This relentless activity was another way to drown out the hidden illness of her own thoughts. By staying in constant motion, she didn't have to face the silence of her empty bed or the reality that she was the last of her line. Modern science suggests that Elizabeth's behavior in her final months, the staring, the silence, and the refusal to sit, was not just madness, but a deep-seated reaction to the lead poisoning we discussed earlier. Chronic lead exposure doesn't just damage the skin, it destroys the nervous system. It leads to a condition known as lead encephalopathy, which causes high levels of anxiety, cognitive decline, and a terrifying loss of motor control. This explains why she feared her bed. To a person suffering from the neurological effects of lead, the sensation of lying down can feel like falling into a void. Her standing for 15 hours wasn't just an act of will, it was a desperate attempt to stay grounded in a world that was literally spinning out of her control. She was dying from the very makeup she used to look immortal. It is a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. The queen who saved England was killed by her own vanity and the toxic beauty standards of her age. As the sun set on the Tudor dynasty, the world stood at a crossroads. Elizabeth had spent 44 years holding back the tide of the future. She refused to name an heir because she knew that the moment she did, her own light would fade. Men used to worship the rising sun rather than the setting sun, she once said. She was a woman who understood the fickle nature of loyalty. By the time she finally signaled to her advisors that James of Scotland should succeed her, she was beyond speech. She had held on to the power until her very last breath, ensuring that no man could ever say he took the crown from her. She gave it up only when death itself forced her hand. The story of Elizabeth I is a story of what we lose when we win everything. She won the war against Spain, she won the war against her rivals, and she won the war for history's respect. But she lost the quiet moments of life. She never knew the comfort of a child's hand, the honesty of a friend who didn't want something from her, or the peace of a mind that wasn't constantly scanning for assassins. She was England's greatest queen and its most lonely woman. As her funeral procession moved through the streets of London, the people wept as if they had lost their own mother. They knew that with her, a certain kind of magic was leaving the world. The Virgin Queen was gone, leaving behind a nation that was ready to face the world, even if she had never been ready to face herself. To bridge the gap to our final goal, we must look at the immediate aftermath of her passing, the moment the Golden Age met the cold reality of a new dynasty. The silence that fell over Richmond Palace on that March morning was deafening. For 44 years, England had known only one voice, one signature, and one face. As the royal messenger raced toward Scotland to deliver the news to James VI, he carried with him the sapphire ring Elizabeth had worn, a prearranged signal that the Tudor era was officially over. But the transition was far from smooth. The common people, who had prayed for good Queen Bess every Sunday, felt a sense of cosmic dread. They hadn't just lost a ruler, they had lost their protector, the only stable point in a world of religious chaos. The new king, James, was a stranger with a strange accent and a very different view of the world. He didn't understand the theater of the court or the delicate bond Elizabeth had nurtured with her subjects. Almost overnight, the cult of Elizabeth shifted from a living reality to a nostalgic dream.
In the years following her death, the Virgin Queen underwent a secondary transformation. No longer a woman struggling with health and heartbreak, she became a national myth. During the reign of the Stuarts, when the country faced political unrest and civil war, people looked back at Elizabeth's reign as a lost paradise. This nostalgia is what fueled the legends we know today. The stories of her hidden illness were often used by later generations to explain why she was so unique, as if her greatness required some form of physical or psychological suffering to be believable. But modern science offers a different perspective. We now understand that Elizabeth was a pioneer in personal branding. Long before the age of social media, she understood that a leader's image is their most potent weapon.
She lived her life in a glass house, and her illness was the weight of that constant visibility. Even today, Elizabeth I continues to haunt our imagination. She has been portrayed by more actresses than almost any other historical figure, from Bette Davis to Cate Blanchett. Each generation finds something new in her. The 19th century saw her as a romantic, tragic figure. The 20th century saw her as a feminist icon. And today, we see her as a complex study in mental health, trauma, and the toxic nature of fame. We look at her lead-painted face and see the ancestors of our own filters and digital masks. Her struggle to balance a public career with a private soul is a struggle that resonates more than ever in our connected world. She was the first global celebrity, and she paid the celebrity price, a life where the real you eventually disappears behind the legend. As we reach the conclusion of this extensive narrative, we are left with a final, quiet thought. In the vault of Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth lies directly on top of her half-sister, Mary I. The two sisters who spent their lives at odds, representing two different Englands, are now joined in the silence of the stone. The inscription on their tomb reads, "Partners both in throne and grave, here we rest two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection." It is perhaps the only time Elizabeth was ever truly a partner with anyone. The loneliness that defined her life was finally broken by the one thing she couldn't outrun. The hidden illness of the Virgin Queen wasn't just lead poisoning or a thyroid condition or a childhood trauma. It was the crown itself. It was a heavy, golden burden that demanded everything and gave back only immortality. Elizabeth Tudor accepted that trade. She gave us the Renaissance, the defeat of the Armada, and the foundation of the modern world. In return, she asked only that we remember her not as a broken woman, but as a queen who was married to her people. And 4 centuries later, we are still telling her story. We are still searching for the girl behind the white paint, the heart behind the silver breastplate, and the woman who chose to stand when the world told her to lie down. But the legacy of Elizabeth I extends far beyond the cold stone of a tomb. It lives on in the very fabric of the modern world she helped create. To understand the full scale of her impact, we must look at the global stage she set during her long, solitary reign. When she ascended the throne, England was a bankrupt, divided island on the fringes of Europe. By the time she died, it was a burgeoning global power with its sights on the Americas and the East. This transition was not an accident. It was the result of a woman who utilized her hidden illness, the anxiety and need for control, to forge a navy that would eventually dominate the world's oceans. She empowered privateers like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh, men who were essentially state-sponsored pirates, to challenge the Spanish monopoly on the New World. This bold, often reckless strategy was born from Elizabeth's realization that England could not compete with the sheer size of the Spanish Empire through traditional means. She had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless.
The 16th century was a time of intellectual rebirth, and Elizabeth was its greatest patron. Under her watch, the English language was transformed from a coarse Germanic tongue into a vehicle for some of the greatest literature ever written. She didn't just tolerate the arts, she understood their power as propaganda. The works of William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe weren't just entertainment, they were the cultural heartbeat of her reign, reflecting the tensions, the glories, and the anxieties of her age. The Elizabethan identity was forged in the theaters of Bankside, where the Queen's image was often mirrored in the characters on stage, strong, flawed, and infinitely complex. This cultural explosion was her gift to the future, ensuring that the spirit of her age would never truly fade. Even the way we perceive leadership today owes a debt to Elizabeth Tudor. She was the first to master the art of the political pivot, changing her mind and her alliances with a speed that left her enemies reeling. She proved that a leader's greatest strength isn't always their army, but
but their ability to control the narrative. She was a master of the golden speech, knowing exactly when to show strength and when to show humility. This ability to communicate directly with the hearts of her subjects created a bond that was stronger than any legal contract. She understood that a monarch's power ultimately rests on the consent and the love of the governed, a revolutionary idea that would later form the basis of modern democracy. As we look back at the bizarre food rules, the toxic makeup, and the layers of royal etiquette, we see a woman who was constantly building a wall between herself and the world. But that wall was also a mirror, reflecting the hopes and fears of an entire nation. Her illness was the struggle of a human soul trying to survive inside an icon. She was the woman who had everything, yet had to sacrifice the simple joys of life to keep it. She lived in a world of shadows so that England could step into the light. The Elizabethan queen was a self-imposed prison, but it was also a fortress that protected a kingdom. The story of Elizabeth I is a reminder that history is not just made of dates and battles, but of human hearts and private pains. We remember the Armada, but we must also remember the trembling hand holding the quill. We remember the mask of youth, but we must also remember the girl who lost her mother to the executioner's axe. Elizabeth Tudor was a queen of contradictions, magnificent yet miserable, powerful yet paralyzed by fear, a woman who belonged to everyone but herself. And in that complexity, she remains one of the most fascinating figures to ever walk the stage of history. 400 years later, we are still under her spell, still trying to solve the mystery of the woman who reigned alone and died standing up, the eternal Queen of England. To truly understand the depths of the Elizabethan world, we must step out of the palace and into the winding, narrow streets of 16th-century London, where the Queen's shadow loomed over every alleyway. This was a city of nearly 200,000 people, a chaotic heart of a nation where life was cheap, but the Queen's law was absolute. Elizabeth's hidden illness of anxiety translated into a state of constant civil regulation. She was obsessed with order because she knew that a riot in the streets of London was just as dangerous as an invasion from Spain. This led to the creation of the sumptuary laws, which dictated exactly what kind of clothes you could wear based on your social rank. If you were caught wearing silk or velvet and you weren't a noble, you could be fined or imprisoned. Elizabeth used fashion as a social map. She wanted to look at a crowd and know exactly who was who. It was her way of keeping the world predictable when her own internal world was often a storm of doubt.
The common people of this era lived in a state of sensory overload. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke, raw sewage, and the heavy perfumes used by the wealthy to mask the stench of the city. Yet in the midst of this grime, there was a fierce pride in the Virgin Queen. Every year, on November 17th, the anniversary of her accession, the city erupted in celebration. This wasn't just a government-mandated holiday, it was a genuine outpouring of relief. The people remembered the bloody reign of her sister Mary and the terrifying uncertainty of the religious wars. Elizabeth represented a middle way, a fragile peace that allowed trade to flourish. While she starved herself of emotional intimacy in the palace, she fed the nation's hunger for stability. She was the mother who never had children, and the people were her unruly, loving offspring. But even this public love had a dark side. The 1590s were a time of the Great Dearth, a series of failed harvests that brought England to the brink of starvation. While the Queen still maintained her elaborate banquets to show strength to foreign ambassadors, her subjects were dying of hunger in the countryside. This created a massive tension. Elizabeth, ever the master of image, responded by ordering the wealthy to restrict their own meals and give the excess to the poor. She understood that if the people saw the crown as indifferent to their suffering, the cult of Elizabeth would shatter.
Even in her old age, with her health failing and her mind clouded by lead poisoning, she would force herself to go on progresses, traveling across the country to be seen by the people. She would sit in the sweltering heat or the freezing rain, smiling and waving, because she knew that the sight of her was the only thing holding the country together. It was a physical sacrifice that few modern leaders could endure. Within the walls of her various palaces, Whitehall, Greenwich, Richmond, the atmosphere was one of competitive servitude. To be a courtier was to live in a state of permanent audition. You had to be a poet, a soldier, a diplomat, and a fashion icon all at once. Elizabeth encouraged this rivalry. She would play her favorites against each other, giving a jewel to one and a cold stare to the other, just to see how they would react. This was her divide and rule strategy applied to her own household. It kept anyone from becoming too powerful, but it also meant that the palace was a place of zero trust. There was no HR department in the Tudor court. Your career depended entirely on the Queen's mood. This is why the bizarre food rules we discussed earlier were so important. If you were invited to eat near the Queen, you were in. If you were relegated to the lower tables, you were out. Food was the currency of status. One of the most fascinating and least discussed aspects of Elizabeth's daily life was her obsession with cleanliness in an age that was notoriously dirty. She famously bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not, which was considered incredibly frequent for the time. She had a specialized bathingsman and used sponges made of fine silk. This was part of her virgin image. She had to be pure, white, and unstained. She used rose water and lavender to scent her skin, creating an olfactory aura that signaled her arrival before she even entered a room. This was another layer of her mask. By smelling like a garden in a city that smelled like a grave, she reinforced her divine status. As the 1600s dawned, a new kind of darkness settled over the Queen. The execution of the Earl of Essex, a man she had once loved, or at least favored deeply, broke something inside her. Essex had led a pathetic, failed rebellion against her, and although she had no choice but to sign his death warrant, the guilt haunted her. She stopped eating almost entirely. Her hidden illness moved from the physical to the spiritual. She began to see the ghosts of her past in every shadow. She would spend hours staring at a single spot on the wall, her finger in her mouth like a child, lost in a trance of grief. The mask of youth was now a literal mask. Her skin underneath was like parchment. Yet when the Spanish ambassador asked for an audience, she rose, put on her heaviest gown, and out-talked him for 2 hours. The Queen was a shell, but the shell was made of iron.
We often wonder what Elizabeth would think of our world today. She would likely be horrified by our lack of formality, but she would recognize our obsession with brand. She was the original influencer, a woman who understood that if you control the eyes of the people, you control their hearts. Her tragedy was that she became a prisoner of her own brand. She couldn't grow old, she couldn't be sick, and she couldn't be human. She had to be the Virgin Queen until the second her heart stopped beating. The story of Elizabeth I is a masterclass in the cost of greatness. It tells us that you can change the world, you can defeat armadas, and you can spark a golden age, but you cannot do it without losing a piece of your soul. She was the most successful monarch in English history, and perhaps the most lonely human being to ever wear a crown. She left behind a world that was louder, richer, and more daring than the one she found, but she left it as she had lived in it, alone, standing, and silent. To truly comprehend the iron grip Elizabeth held over her nation, we must explore the dark underbelly of her power, the shadowy world of Elizabethan espionage. If the banquet hall was her stage, then the back rooms of London were her engine. Her hidden illness of paranoia wasn't just a personal quirk, it was a state necessity. Under the direction of Sir Francis Walsingham, England developed a surveillance system that would make modern intelligence agencies blush. They mastered the art of ciphers, complex mathematical codes used to encrypt letters. Walsingham employed the best code breakers and forgers in Europe. They would intercept letters from Catholic conspirators, carefully open the wax seals, copy the contents, and then reseal them so perfectly that the sender never knew they were compromised. This climate of secrecy meant that even within the Queen's private dining chambers, every servant was a potential informant. Elizabeth used this information like a weapon. She would often drop hints to her courtiers about their private conversations, letting them know that she saw everything and heard everything. This psychological dominance was more effective than any standing army. It kept her rivals in a state of perpetual fear and her allies in a state of absolute loyalty. But imagine the cost of living in such a world. Elizabeth could never truly relax. Every meal was a test, every gift a possible trap, and every friend a possible spy. This constant pressure is likely what led to her late-night wanderings through the palace, clutching a sword and demanding to see the guards. She was a woman who had mastered the world, but could never master her own peace of mind. While the Queen navigated the treacherous waters of court politics, her sea dogs were navigating the literal waters of the Atlantic. Men like Sir Humphrey Gilbert and Martin Frobisher were driven by a mixture of religious zeal and a desperate hunger for gold. Elizabeth viewed the sea as her final frontier. She understood that for England to survive, it had to break out of its island isolation. This era saw the first attempts at English colonization in North America, the ill-fated Roanoke colony. When the settlers vanished into the mists of history, leaving behind only the word Croatoan carved into a tree, it was a devastating blow to Elizabeth's dreams of an overseas empire. Yet she didn't stop. She saw every failure as a lesson. This resilience was the hallmark of the Tudor spirit. She was a woman who had survived the execution of her mother and the wrath of her sister. She wasn't going to be defeated by a vanished colony or a vast ocean. In the final years of her reign, Elizabeth's relationship to her people took on a spiritual, almost mystical quality. She was no longer just a ruler, she was the Virgin Queen, a secular replacement for the Virgin Mary in a Protestant land. Her progresses through the countryside became pilgrimages. People would travel for days just to catch a glimpse of her royal carriage. She would often order her guards to stand back so the poor could approach her. There is a story of an old woman who gave her a small bunch of rosemary, a plant associated with remembrance. Elizabeth kept it in her hand for the entire day, a simple gesture that won her more loyalty than 1,000 laws. She understood the power of the common touch. While she was a goddess to the nobles, she was good Queen Bess to the chimney sweeps and the farmers. This dual identity was her greatest achievement.
However, the physical decay was reaching its breaking point. The mask of youth was failing. The lead in her makeup had likely caused her hair to fall out, requiring her to wear increasingly elaborate red wigs. Her skin was so damaged that she could no longer bear to look in mirrors. She ordered all the mirrors in the palace to be removed or covered. This is the ultimate tragedy of a beauty-obsessed queen. She lived in a world where she was the icon of perfection, yet she couldn't stand the sight of her own reflection. She was a ghost haunting her own palace, a woman whose image had become her own worst enemy. As we reach the final stage of this 10,000-word journey, we look at the legacy she left behind. Elizabeth didn't just leave a kingdom, she left a blueprint for the modern age. She proved that a woman could rule alone, that an island could become an empire, and that a leader's greatest strength is their mind. She was the bridge between the medieval world of faith and the modern world of reason. When she died, the bell tolled not just for a queen, but for an entire way of life. The Tudor era was over, but the Elizabethan spirit was just beginning. She had turned a small, broken country into the center of the world, and she did it while carrying a burden of loneliness and illness that would have crushed a lesser soul. Elizabeth I was the architect of her own legend. She chose the paint, she chose the rules, and she chose the silence. She lived her life as a masterpiece of political theater, and, like all great theater, it left the audience wanting more. Even now, 400 years later, we are still the audience. We are still captivated by the woman who refused to sit, the queen who refused to marry, and the human being who refused to be forgotten. She remains, as she always wished to be, the sun around which English history revolves, bright, distant, and eternally mysterious. The final journey of Elizabeth Tudor began on a cold, misty morning in March 1603 as her funeral cortege wound its way through the narrow, crowded streets of London toward Westminster Abbey. It was a spectacle of grief unlike anything the world had ever seen. Thousands of people, from the highest nobles to the poorest beggars, stood in a stunned, heavy silence that was broken only by the sound of rhythmic weeping. A lifelike effigy of the queen, dressed in her full coronation robes and wearing the crown she had protected for 44 years, lay atop the lead coffin. To the common folk watching, it felt as though the very sun was being buried. They knew in their hearts that the golden age was passing into the shadows of the past, and that the world would never again see a monarch who ruled with such a singular, lonely, and fierce devotion to her people. Within the hallowed walls of the abbey, Elizabeth was laid to rest in the north aisle of Henry VIII's chapel. In a final act of historical irony, she was eventually joined by the sister who had once imprisoned her, Mary I. Their tomb, a masterpiece of white marble, stands as a silent monument to the two women who defined the soul of England. But while Mary's legacy is often shrouded in the blood of her reign, Elizabeth's legacy became the foundation of an empire. The hidden illness that had plagued her, the toxic lead poisoning, the chronic anxiety, and the trauma of her childhood, was finally quieted. The white paint was gone, the heavy jewels were removed, and the Virgin Queen was finally at peace, leaving behind a nation that she had transformed from a bankrupt island into the most powerful force on the globe. The centuries that followed have only added to her mystery. In the modern era, we look at the artifacts she left behind, the silk stockings, the locket rings, and the handwritten letters, and we see a woman who was a pioneer of the human spirit. She proved that power is not just about armies and gold, but about the strength of one's will. She navigated a world designed by men, for men, and she did it by becoming more than a woman. She became an institution. Her choice to remain unmarried, though it cost her the warmth of a family, ensured that England would never be a mere province of a foreign power. She was the architect of British independence, a leader who understood that to serve a nation, one must sometimes sacrifice the self.
As we conclude this epic saga, we are left with the image of Elizabeth in her final hours, standing resolutely in her chambers, refusing to lie down. It is the ultimate symbol of her reign. She stood against the Spanish Armada, she stood against the Pope, she stood against her advisors, and in the end, she stood against death itself for as long as humanly possible. She was a queen who lived on her feet and died on her terms. Her story is a reminder that greatness often comes at a terrible price, and that the brightest lights in history often cast the deepest shadows. Elizabeth I was the last of the Tudors, but she remains the first in the hearts of those who admire courage, intelligence, and the enduring power of a woman's soul. She was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the mother of her people, and her legend will echo through the halls of time forever.